So I'm going to be antiquing a bird skull Cameo. This is a 30 by 40 millimeter Cameo back with the bird skull rendered in 3D. And the first thing I usually do is I take a very slightly damp paintbrush and brush off any dust or little bits of plastic or anything that might be on there. And at this stage, it doesn't really matter if your brush is clean or not. So like my brush is a little dirty from painting another bird skull earlier. But you see that gives you a nice clean background to start with. And then you want to take the brush into your paint. I usually use the paint that's in the lid because it tends to be easier to control the amount of paint on the brush. And you don't need a huge amount. You just need like about what you would do if you were painting on a canvas. So not a tiny amount, not a large amount, just about that much, kind of on the edge of your brush. You don't want to soak it in there. And I just start. What you want to do is just sort of, I think of it as tickling the Cameo. You just want to make sure that you get the paint down into any of the little crevices, because that's going to give you your best antiquing effect. And it doesn't matter if you get some on the cabochon portion, because we are actually going to paint over the background later. I find that with these, it's best to just get enough paint on there in the first place, and then you can clean that off afterwards, or just paint right over any mistakes that you make where you get it on the cabochon portion. So see, I'm not being particularly careful there. And you do want to work quickly because acrylic paint does actually dry quite quickly, but having the paint in this slightly dry consistency in the first place actually does work better if you're antiquing the way that I do it. If you're doing a wash, then you're definitely going to want to use a completely different technique. This is a technique that I originally used when I was learning how to use wax colorant, and like rub and buff and Renaissance wax, things like that. And I found that it actually works very nicely with the acrylic paint on a 3D surface. So once you've got it thoroughly coated, just making sure I get the back there. Once your object is thoroughly coated, then what you want to do is just go ahead and start wiping with your hands. So this is why I wear the rubber gloves while I'm working. It's not just to not have to scrub tons of paint off my hands later, but also because the glove actually becomes part of your toolkit. So if you see I'm using a black nitrile painter's glove, and really any kind of glove will work as long as it has this little bit of texture to it. A completely smooth one just isn't as efficient. So I just go and start, not hard, not soft, kind of just a medium pressure, wiping at the surface. And you see I move around a lot to get a lot of different angles. And what this does is you're both rubbing the paint off of the high surfaces that you want to rebuff and pushing it harder into the low surfaces where you do want it. And I typically do this a couple of times. So you'll see me wipe something and then come back and paint right over what I just wiped and paint it again. Because I actually find that seems to work better than trying to just do one coat. So if I don't get as much antiquing as I want on the first round, I just do a second round. And usually I'll do, after I've let it dry for a few minutes, I'll come back and do a final. This actually doesn't look like it needs a second layer of antiquing. So if I'm satisfied with how it looks and I feel like I can just go straight from here, I'll just keep cleaning it. And the other thing, I think I might put a little more brown on this side. The other thing that you want to do is have a variety of sizes of brush. So if you have little spots that you want to put a little extra paint in there, you're not dealing with that big broom-shaped brush all the time. I like to put a little bit on the side of the beak. And because this is molded from a real skull by the person who first made these cabochons, you are going to run into it being asymmetrical a little bit because real animals are not symmetrical. Just like if you look at yourself in a mirror, you can actually tell your right and your left side of your face are going to be a little different, and all animals are like that. And plants, usually too. So what I'm doing now is kind of poking around with my little brush and seeing if there's anywhere that I need to get just a little more antiquing into. This one's actually coming together quite nicely. It's sort of weird to say I hoped I would make mistakes so I could show you how to fix them, but I might go over that in another video. This is just a practice round for me to get used to how to work with the video feed. So I probably am saying way too much, and I'm likely to say odd things that I mutter to myself constantly, and I am probably going to say something that I later go, oop, I shouldn't have said that, because I always do. So you can see as you're going through, you can put just a little bit extra of the paint. So this paintbrush that I'm using right now, it's a 5-0 brush, and what that it's just a size marker, and some companies are a little different than others. So let me see if I can get a good focus on the tip of this brush. It's very tiny. So this actually is a brush intended for painting like Warhammer figures, miniature paintings, you know, like if you're painting very, very small details. And I like this particular brush because it does have these nice bristles here that you can see what you're doing well. Because when I get a black one, if I'm working with black paint, sometimes I can't tell how much paint is on my brush, and that's very annoying. So this particular copy of this Cameo has a little funky bit right here where it looks like this little piece of mold flash, and sometimes I'll break those off, and sometimes I just don't worry about it. It's not very noticeable on this one, so I'm just going to try to leave that dark while I am cleaning off the rest. So I think that's good for the antiquing. And when you first start doing these, don't worry if it takes you like half an hour to do one Cameo. Because when I started, I was very slow at these, and I often had to paint them 2 or 3 times before I liked the result. So I am going to go get, I forgot to bring the Q-tips, so I'm going to go grab a Q-tip. I'm pausing the video. I'll be right back. Okay. So this is just your very standard cotton swab that you would use, you know, on your ears. Nothing special. You can get ones that have a little less fuzz on it that are more or less meant for what I'm doing, or you can use, you know, an eyeshadow applicator. They also make Q-tips that are kind of pointy. Those are very nice. But for these skulls, in this size, I find just your standard bathroom Q-tip is a pretty good tool. So I'm just taking out a little bit of the paint that's here in the eye socket so you can see the bone structure a little better. And like I said, you can always go back in and put more paint. I find it's best to go ahead and apply a little more paint than you necessarily need in the first place, and then take off more than you necessarily need to take off, and go back and touch it up. Actually gives you a better result. So like I said, don't worry if it takes you kind of a long time for this process, because actually taking your time will give you a better result. And I do often just clean up a little bit with the Q-tip in the areas that are too narrow to get my fingers in. There we go. So if you have anywhere that you have like a little teeny tiny space that you want to get into, I actually find a toothpick is also a very great tool to be using. And these are seriously the cheapest, like crappy quality toothpicks that you get at the dollar store. Ironically, they work better for this purpose than like a nice, more solid, safer to use toothpick. And I find that very funny because most of the time when you're doing art, you're like, oh, I need the good brushes. Oh, I need the good paint. You know, all my tools have to be nice and sharp. And what's funny is when you're painting cameos, it's actually the opposite. The only thing that needs to be good is your paintbrushes. So the inexpensive paint from, Michael's, Joann's, Hobby Lobby, what have you, order it on Amazon. So I actually use these very cheap paints, and the bottle it's 2 fluid ounces is actually a lot of paint for this purpose. So these are maybe a smaller amount of paint than you would want if you're making a canvas painting. But if you do what I do with the little miniatures, this is like 2 years supply of paint. And if you keep it with the lid on when you're not using it, store it in a cool, dry place, it actually will last a long time. And if it gets goopy on the inside, it doesn't really matter because I paid $1.99 for this and I can get more anytime. So just showing here, you can actually use the toothpick to buff up just a little bit here and there where you want to take up the fine detail again. And it's a great tool. It really helps. You can use it on anything that you're making. And so see how I'm using the side of it here? What that does is it just gives me a very fine buffing edge. And you don't want to press hard, you just want to rub it lightly. You can see how I can get this nice little bit of highlight right there without having to paint over or, remove and reapply the paint a whole lot. And if you do it too much, you can always just go back through, touch it up a little bit again. But I like to highlight the very high spots this way. And I think it looks really good. So that is step 1, which is putting on the brown antiquing. And I'm going to come back and touch this up just a little bit again after it's dried slightly, because I do want to get that eye socket a little darker. But I have to go to work now. So I will upload a part 2 later. Thank you.